Lopato, and today I'm here to present my paper for the St. John's Gap Grant, Meaning, Self-Transcendence, and Self-Perception on the connection between psychological altruism and the will. Now, the problem that I tried to answer or inquire about initially was the idea that following the death of a spouse or retirement, people have an increased mortality rate. There was a study done by Professor Carol Hart who linked bereaved participants in the study with a higher rate of death immediately following the death of their spouse. And I imagine that the same is true for a lot of career-oriented people who can't really find anything to do in retirement. Now, what I'm trying to answer is not if this phenomenon occurs, but why the phenomenon occurs. Namely, why and how does this connection to others have such a drastic effect on the will to maintain the most critical aspect of life, the life itself, and how can we overcome this? Now, in the essay, I have three main purposes. First is to provide an exegetical account of the work of Thomas Nagel and of Viktor Frankl, each of whom discussed the idea of agency. To summarize these briefly, Nagel talks about how the performance of altruistic actions necessarily requires that the agency of others be respected. And Frankl states that the acknowledgement of others' agency is necessary for self-transcendence. The second goal of this essay is to show through a series of thought experiments and phenomenological research the requirements for respecting agency under the problematic hypothetical imperative that we desire to perform truly altruistic actions and thus to provide the capability to transcend ourselves, to provide the fuel for constant effort to maintain life. And the third point of this essay is to use this information to answer the fundamental question, namely, why is there such a connection between connections with others and the will? Now, I'll begin by discussing Thomas Nagel, who in 1970 wrote a book called The Possibility of Altruism. Now, in The Possibility of Altruism, Nagel argues that altruism is analogous to prudence in several ways, and he begins his work taking a look at prudence. Now, prudence for Nagel is the idea that our future motives provide us with reasons to take certain actions in the present. More specifically, he says, our own future interests provide us by themselves with reasons for present action to secure them, and that motivation of this type cannot and need not be explained by intermediate present desires or any other intermediate motive. So in other words, there's a direct connection between taking an action now and having reason to do so in the future. One of the key points behind the idea of prudence is the view of time and the self. When acting prudently, one does not perceive oneself as acting in a series of separate moments. Rather, in order to act prudently and to have that link between present desires for the future and present action, one has to see oneself as acting continuously in such a way that all actions affect himself equally, regardless of the time at which they were taken. So, in other words, there is no special character to the present moment that differentiates the present moment from any other moment. There's no series of time slices. And if we were to view time and the self as being made up of a series of time slices, then we would necessarily have to view ourselves as a corresponding series of different selves in different time slices, which is not consistent with the idea of prudence, which requires a consistent self. Now, Nagel goes on to connect altruism to prudence in stating that a prudent person views the present as a time among others, whereas an altruistic person views himself as a person among others. Nagel's definition of altruism differs from some others, and it's a somewhat limited definition, but I take this one as well. It is not abject self-sacrifice, but merely a willingness to act in consideration of the interests of other persons without the need for ulterior motives. Which leaves us with the question, how do we act in such consideration? Viktor Frankl published a book called The Will to Meaning in 1988. And one of the central premises in this book is that man has the capability for self-detachment. He can detach himself not only from a situation, but also from himself. And this detachment allows him with a means to attempt to understand the motivations, the thought processes, and the intentions of other human beings. Now, for Frankl, this self-detachment is not absolute in the sense that we can understand perfectly what's going on in the mind of someone else, because he does admit that we are in varying degrees blind to other people. But even though we must start an analysis of someone else in the context of what we know, there is a capability to learn from and to truly interact with others. Now, when an agent's interests or intentions are unexpectedly different from that of another, if I think you're going to do one thing, then you do another, we arrive at a misunderstanding. But this is okay with Frank. And this is because rather than seeing a common understanding of, or rather than looking for a common understanding of individuals' perspectives on the world, Frankl was instead looking for something else. He wants to see a common understanding of the manner in which we can understand other people's perspectives on the world. And thus, when the existentialist makes a claim to objectivity, he's not seeking a universal principle to be followed or analyzed in itself, but rather a universal principle for determining what universal principles can exist and are capable of being created. Now, Frankl goes on further to say that the interests of others who we care about are projected into our own view of the world. One of the more famous examples from his book is the example of the Temple Stone. Prior to the Holocaust, Frankl had a visa to go to escape his native country, and he was just about to head out when the Nazis destroyed a temple in his hometown. His father brought back one stone from the temple, and Frankl looked at it, and it was the commandment to honor his mother and father. And his concern for his father was projected through his viewing of that stone, and he eventually decided not to go and to stick with his family through that struggle. I also see here a connection in terms of projection to Jean-Paul Sartre, in the sense that Sartre says, when will the beloved become in turn the lover? When the beloved projects being loved. So in our interaction with others, once we have a concern for another, we project that concern onto our own perspective on the world. Now, Frankl argues that we can find meaning in life by acknowledging the agency of others and, in doing so, transcending ourselves. Specifically by creating a work, by doing a deed, by experiencing goodness, truth, beauty, by experiencing nature or culture, and last but not least, encountering another unique being in the very uniqueness of this human being, in other words, by loving him. This provides one with a larger context in which to view his life, one in which he has a positive purpose toward the benefit of something beyond himself. Now, this in turn, too, is projected into our relationships with others. We can share the idea with others that meaning can be achieved by treating them as agents by projecting to them that they allow us to transcend ourselves and that the same transcendence is possible for them. In other words, it is possible to be psychologically altruistic toward them. And on this note, Frankl had spoken with a person who was considering suicide. He got a call early in the morning from the woman, and he presented arguments for why she should not commit the act. But looking back on it, he discovered something interesting. He discovered that the only reason she had decided not to commit suicide was the fact that rather than growing angry with him for disturbing him in the morning, he patiently listened to her and talked to her for more than half an hour. And a world she found in which this can happen must be a world worth living in. But we still are left with the question, how exactly do we acknowledge others' agency? Now, one answer is the Catholic answer, so to speak, and this is the golden rule, namely, treat others the way you would want to be treated. Now, philosophically, this equates roughly to the universalizability of actions, and it works in very broad circumstances. For example, I want to be respected, so I can imagine that John wants to be respected. And it also works in negative circumstances for the most part as well. I do not want to be stabbed, so I can imagine that John does not want to be stabbed either. But it's less effective significantly in particular circumstances. For example, in order to acknowledge others' agency, I must detach myself. I cannot understand another person purely on my own terms. For example, let's say that I am an autocrat who's governing a small territory, and I can make whatever rules or legislation that I want. Let's say I'm a fairly family-oriented person, so if I were in the position of a citizen, I would want fairly family-oriented rules. But what if one of my citizens is a career-oriented person? By instituting family-oriented rules in this society, then I would not be respecting the agency of that person using the golden rule. There are other ways in which I could do it, and perhaps even those rules could exist. But that being said, putting myself in his place would not be sufficient to understanding his motive. In addition, I cannot apply my own judgments about myself to another person regarding himself. Let's say, for example, that I'm proud of myself because I'm a good musician. It would be a non sequitur to assume that John is also proud of himself for being a good musician, even if he is indeed a good musician. Now, the inverse is true as well. It doesn't necessarily follow that John is not proud of himself because he is not a good musician. And in addition, this extends beyond judgments of skills to judgments of qualities as well. So let's say that I'm proud of my ability to focus. It doesn't necessarily follow that John may be proud of his ability to focus, even if this is one of his best qualities. For example, John may consider breadth rather than depth to be advantageous, or perhaps practical learning to be advantageous, and see himself as lacking in this regard. Or, on the contrary, if he's poor at focusing but very broad-minded or practical, or very good at learning practically, he may have no lack of pride due to his focusing ability. Now, acknowledging agency as well demands that I recognize I can learn from others' differing judgments. Let's say that I'm good at analysis, but I either don't view it to be a valuable skill or don't realize that I'm good at it, or perhaps think that decisions should be made in a different manner. And John thinks that analysis is important and values my analytical skills. Maybe he even sees it as my best quality. From this, John presents a reason for this judgment, and in doing so, he has taught me to see myself in a different way that I may not previously have considered. I may not necessarily take anything from this judgment, but from that judgment, I can learn to view myself in a different respect than I had before. Sartre refers to this idea as the look of the other, and it's an important component in understanding agency. Now, how does this affect our actions? I must understand others' values and intentions to be able to help them in a way which is truly valuable. Let's say, for example, that I value musicianship and focus, and John values neither musicianship nor focus, and he doesn't pursue either of them. I may want to help John by helping him to learn an instrument or to focus, but doing so is not an altruistic action. At the best, it's a waste of both of our time. At the worst, I may be demonstrating to John his lack of capabilities in those areas, and if my judgment has any impact on him, then there may be some negative result from that as well. The only way in which I can really discover how my positive intent to help John will actually be of help to John is to learn about him as an individual, not to type him in different categories, not anything else, but to specifically learn about him, his motivations, and his intentions. I can ask him what he values. I can ask him if he wants to be pushed in a certain direction. I can detach myself from my own thought process to discover what he considers a better life than the one he has, and in general, gather information for myself about what his intentions are. Now, this does not mean I'm obligated to help him in ways I find to be repulsive to my own values. It simply means that in order to realize my altruism towards John and to perform a truly altruistic action, I must center those altruistic actions on actions which are actually conducive to John's interests. Now, this brings us to the problematic hypothetical imperative. If we were to act in manners conducive to, or at least not harmful to, their interests, we cannot simply do what we feel would be best for a person, but rather we must at least attempt to understand others' motivations for acting. So, if I'm to understand John truly, I must ask not whether John is proud of himself for being broad-minded, but instead why John is proud of himself for being broad-minded. If I don't ask the why question here, then I have not truly understood John. I've only understood a fact about John. Now, one way that a more religious person can do this in their personal life is through prayer. Let's say that I'm of a polytheistic religion that believes in two gods, the God of health and the God of competition. And let's say that I want to be able to run 3 miles. I could pray to the God of health that I can run 3 miles, and in doing so, I would be acknowledging a desire to be able to run 3 miles for the purpose of health. On the other hand, let's say that I prayed for the God of competition to be able to run 3 miles. I would be acknowledging a desire to run 3 miles for the purpose of competition. Say I'm a soccer player or whatnot. But when we bring a God in who represents all things that are objectively good, whether one believes in this God only epistemologically or ontologically as well, when we pray to that God, we are establishing an intent for goodness. So if I pray for John to a God I believe to be all objective goodness, or simply objectively good, then I'm acknowledging my intent to help John for the sake of what is good for John, not necessarily to help John for the sake of what is good for me or what is good without respect to either of us. And in that respect, a religious person can establish an intent to respect others' agency. Now, in conclusion, life requires a constant effort, and someone who is complacent by means of a gravity-like force will generally watch his skills get rusty, his possessions fall to others, and his relationships to decay. He needs some sort of fuel to provide this constant effort. Ultimately, it's the transcendence of ourselves by means of some object of our affection, whether it be an idea, a career, or most commonly a person, which provides us with a motivation to work, a motivation to improve our skills, and to improve our relationships, to maintain ourselves, and to provide fuel to engage in this constant effort. Ultimately, in order for the object of affection to have this effect, it must be treated not as an object, but as a subject, for only in treating this as a subject will it allow us to transcend ourselves toward it. To fulfill this promise of self-transcendence, we must have a positive impact on at least one other person in some way, whether they're benefited by the idea to which we dedicate ourselves, whether they're sustained by the career in which we're employed, or whether they themselves are that to which we dedicate ourselves. We cannot transcend ourselves toward an object. This is not to say we can't work toward having objects, but the object itself does not provide transcendence, and this is because the object provides us with no manner in which to demonstrate the positive changes we've made upon others. It does not require the consideration of anyone other than ourselves, and it cannot appreciate our sacrifices. The BMW in my driveway is simply there. It provides no acknowledgement in any way that my work has had a positive impact on others. They could have paid me for that BMW because they value my work, but they could have paid me for that BMW also because I found some sneaky way to get a lot of money. Now, it is only through a knowledge that our work has benefited others that we can experience ourselves as good people, transcend ourselves toward a larger goal, and provide motivation that will push us to work toward that goal, that will push us toward constant effort. And I'm going to end with one more example, and that is this. Imagine that any positive impact you've ever had on anyone is an iceberg. It's floating in the sea, and for the most part, it's hidden from your own view. The world is complex enough that you don't necessarily always realize the positive impacts you've had on others, but there are certain positive impacts you can see. For example, someone has taken your advice and done well, someone has thanked you for an action, and through those gestures, a person can push up someone else's iceberg, and they can have a greater idea of what they've done for the world. This, too, I would argue, is a matter of self-transcendence as well, because you are helping that person create a better self-perception, realize their actions, their altruism, and to eventually have more fuel to continue that effort in the future.